Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all for tonight's Hammer Forum on the upcoming presidential election. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of the Rosenbloom Family Foundation. And I also want to thank our wonderful co-presenters, the Safeguarding Democracy Project at UCLA School of Law. Tonight we have a thought-provoking discussion that will question the risks that come with the acceptance of election results and peaceful transitions of power between Election Day, November 5th, and January 6th, when Congress counts the state's Electoral College votes. For example, will there be delays in reporting vote totals? Probably so. And if so, will it undermine the public's confidence in election results, regardless of how well the election is administered? Before we dive into tonight's discussion, I'd like to highlight some other upcoming programs we have planned. On Tuesday, October 22nd, we have a program with an oceanographer, a glaciologist, and an artist who works with both of them, discussing the impact of climate change on icebergs and how it will affect ocean salinity, temperature, currents, weather, and animal and plant life in the near future. And then I hope you'll join me in casting your ballot at the Hammer. The Hammer will be a voting center from November 2nd to November 5th, so come and vote and enjoy the museum. If you'd like to stay updated on our upcoming programs and events, please sign up for our newsletter on our website, or you can do it out in the theater lobby. Now I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guests for tonight's conversation: Larry Diamond, Ben Ginsberg, Rachel Kleinfeld, Franita Tolson, and our moderator, Rick Hasen. Larry Diamond is a senior fellow in global democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where he leads the program on Arab reform and democracy based at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, which he directed for more than 6 years. He's also a professor by courtesy of political science and sociology at Stanford University, where he's also been recognized for his extraordinary contributions to undergraduate education. In addition, he's a fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he co-chairs programs on China's global sharp power and on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. And he's the author of Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. That means us. Ben Ginsberg is a nationally known political law advocate who represents participants in the political process. His clients have included political parties, political campaigns, candidates, members of Congress and state legislatures, governors, corporations, trade associations, PACs, vendors, donors, and individuals. He represented 4 of the last six Republican presidential nominees. His representations ranged across a variety of election law and regulatory issues, including voting issues and elections, federal and state campaign finance laws, recounts and contests, government investigations, election administration, and redistricting. He served as national counsel to the 2000 and 2004 Bush-Cheney presidential campaigns and played a central role in the 2000 Florida recount, which we all remember. Well, maybe not the youngest in the audience. I remember it very well. Ginsberg also served as co-chair of the bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which produced a very well-received report on best practices and recommendations for state and local officials to make U.S. elections run better. Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld advises governments, philanthropists, and activists on how democracies make major social change. As a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, she's a leading expert on how democracies, including the United States, can improve, with a particular focus on countries facing poor leadership, polarized populations, violence, and corruptions. Kleinfeld's work focuses on the intersection of democracy and security. She regularly briefs the governments of the United States and allied democracies on issues of policing, security sector reform, the rule of law, and improving conflict. And she's also consulted for international organizations such as the European Union, OECD, and the World Bank. She's a senior advisor to the Democracy Funders Network and is a member of the National Task Force on Election Crises in the United States. Franita Tolson is the chair of USC's Gould School of Law. She also holds a faculty appointment in USC's Political Science and International Relations Department. Her scholarship and teaching focus on the areas of election law, constitutional law, legal history, and employment discrimination. She's written on a wide range of topics, including partisan gerrymandering, political parties, the Elections Clause, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the 14th and 15th Amendments. Tolson is one of the co-authors of the leading election law casebook, The Law of Democracy, now in its 6th edition. Her forthcoming book, In Congress We Trust, Enforcing Voting Rights from the Founding to the Jim Crow Era, will be published by Cambridge University Press. Tolson has testified before Congress numerous times on voting rights issues. She's also authored a legal analysis for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Richard Durbin that would explicitly protect the right to vote. I have managed to accidentally delete the introduction for Rick Hasen, so I'm going to wing it. Rick Hasen is an internationally renowned expert on election law issues. He is a professor here at UCLA School of Law and the founder of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. He's written for every major law journal and is extremely involved in election law, but I don't have the precise details in front of me at this moment, but trust me, he's fantastic. So after tonight's discussion, we'll have a chance to continue the conversation over some light refreshments out in the lobby, and I invite you all to join us there. Now, please join me in welcoming Larry Diamond, Ben Ginsberg, Rachel Kleinfeld, Franita Tolson, and our moderator, Rick Hasen.
Well, good evening, everyone. This is the third in our three-part series on issues and risks facing the 2024 elections. And really, in terms of what we're talking about tonight, the period from Election Day until January 6th or maybe even January 20th, you could not get a stronger group of people together. The range of experience and the knowledge here is unparalleled. And I'm really grateful to all of them in their very busy schedules for coming out today to speak with us. I remember back in January of 2009, I was writing for my website, the Election Law blog, and I was writing about the occasion of Barack Obama's inauguration. And I was writing how remarkable it was. It was, here you had George W. Bush, a conservative Republican, who was transferring power to Barack Obama, liberal Democrat. The Obamas went over to the White House, had coffee with the Bushes. They rode together in a limousine over to the inauguration. The inauguration happened, and Obama saw Bush go off on Marine One to go off on his post-presidential life. And no one wondered, would George W. Bush give up power? Right? What I wrote at the time was, in this country, we take peaceful transitions of power for granted. And what I can say about today is that this is no longer true. That in fact, at least judged by my inbox, people are panicked. And I gave two other talks today, and really the number one question is, how is the election going to go? Are we going to be able to make it through, given what the events were in 2020, given the polarization in this country? And so I want to start by turning to Ben. And Ben, I want to ask you first in terms of how we are actually prepared. So are we prepared to have an election that is going to be administered fairly in the face of kind of unprecedented public scrutiny and in some cases harassment of elected officials? And then even if we have a free and fair election, are people going to accept the results, especially if there may be delays? If we wake up Wednesday morning and we don't know because there are still ballots to be counted who the president is. So are we prepared both in terms of administering the election and in terms of the public understanding and accepting the results of that election?
Good evening, everyone. First, thanks very much for having me, and it's great to be on with these folks on the panel. So, Rick, part of your question is much easier than the other part. The answer to are we prepared is that I believe that we are. I say that based on working with numerous election officials across the country. Group I co-chair called Pillars of the Community had the leading election officials from the 6 battleground states together a couple of weeks ago in Ann Arbor, along with national media to brief them. Election officials, especially in the most contentious jurisdictions, have, I think, learned a lot of the lessons from 2020 when they were caught a bit shorthanded, and have prepared well for many more contingencies. Among the contingencies that they have had to plan for is people saying that the results of elections are not accurate. And they've handled that, first of all, by being tremendously transparent in ways they never have been before. So that, and boy, this is a courageous act, they will go out into the community, hold town halls, invite election skeptics in, invite them to kick the tires and answer all the questions, show them the facilities. I do believe they are prepared and that the safeguards in the system that guarantee an accurate and reliable count are in place and are really pretty well documented in all 11 stages. So the second part of the question is, will people accept the results? It's a tad more difficult to put your finger on, given the rhetoric and given the polls that show roughly a third of the American public, mostly Republicans, do not have faith in the reliability of our elections. And so that basic belief, fanned to be sure by Donald Trump over the last 8 years, has had an effect on what the acceptance will be. Another truism is that if it is as close an election as the polls now indicate, it's going to be a long time before we get results. It's not going to happen on election night. 5 of the 7 battleground states have either passed new laws or left in place laws that led to a delay. And as a result, we're not going to know results in a close election anytime soon, maybe not before the weekend at the earliest. And it is also true that that period between the close of polls and when the results are known is sort of a petri dish for election disinformation. And so back to your original question about are the election officials prepared, I think they are better prepared to deal and to answer questions, to pre-bud arguments, and to respond. But it can get a little yeasty in that time period.
Yeah, and I'm going to want to come back to you after I've gone through a first round of questions and ask specifically about if anything can be done to speed this up, especially with Pennsylvania and Wisconsin not changing their rules about how they process the ballots. So, but I'll come back to that. I want to bring in the other panelists first, and first turn to Franita. And first, let me say, Franita, you were at the top of my list of someone to invite here, but knowing that you're Dean of USC Law School, I'm shocked that you have the time to even breathe. So I'm especially appreciative that you were able to come here tonight. And the reason I really wanted you is I feel like, you know, they talk about the fog of war. We're in the midst of a very contentious, polarized period in politics, and what we really need is a historical perspective, and that's what you can tell us. So how does this period that we're in right now compare to American history, which, as I understand it, we haven't always had free and fair elections. We haven't always had peaceful transitions. We've had other moments. So can you leverage history a little bit to give us a sense of where we are and how worried we should be?
So, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. This is the happy part of my day, spending time with you folks, and also spending time with my very distinguished panelists. So, personally, I think we should always be worried, in part because we don't ever fix anything. And I know that sounds extreme, like, you know, The Electoral Count Reform Act, for example, was designed to address some of the problems we had 4 years ago. Every once in a while, we get a piece of legislation that will try to alter some things. But the reality is that structurally, fundamentally, things don't really change. And so for me, every 4 years, it's really just this waiting game to see what happens, how we blow up, especially as we've become more polarized really since the mid-1990s, but arguably earlier than that. But the mid-1990s, you really start to really see it manifested in our politics. And so I think historically, we're also very spoiled. And so this feels crazy, right? You're very worried. It feels disruptive. It feels unusual. But I think for most of American history, we have tended to be polarized. In the last 5 decades, it just felt like there was kind of a consensus around things until there wasn't. And so I think this feels unprecedented, but in some ways it's not. The interesting thing to me, as I sort of thought about this question of how can we learn from this historically, things always come down to a guy. So let me explain, right? I was thinking about the Nebraska situation, right, where there was this whole conversation about switching the way they allocate their Electoral College votes to winner take all. And there was a guy who said no, a Republican state senator who decided that that is not something that should be done before the election. Now, of course, if we end up in a situation where it's 269, and they've changed the rules, then that made it more likely that Trump will win the entirety of the state's Electoral College votes, as opposed to now Nebraska has kind of a hybrid system where they allocate some Electoral College votes by statewide and they do some by congressional district. And so he said no, right? So it is entirely possible that depending on how things work out, that could be a very consequential decision that changed the course of the election. And it brought to mind the election of 1876, where there was also a guy, right? So the Speaker of the House, Samuel Randall, decided not to allow his party to delay the counting of the Electoral College votes because what they wanted to do was sow confusion. They wanted to introduce competing slates in order to deny Rutherford B. Hayes the majority. And so he chose country over party. Now, of course, this did not make him a popular figure in his party, but so often, because we don't really fix anything, our elections tend to come down to a guy, right? And so in my mind, that is a completely dysfunctional way to run a system of elections, and it happens far too often, right? I can think of other times where it's come down to either a person or a group of people, right? Think back to 2020, where you had a group of judges who decided that the 60-plus lawsuits filed challenging the election results were not meritorious, right? That is a group of people who basically were responsible for making sure that the guardrails of democracy held. That is a bonkers way to run a political system. Yet here we are again, trying to figure out who the guy will be this time.
Well, that doesn't make me feel all that relaxed. Today I said I was a 7.5 instead of a 9.9 in terms of my nervousness about the election. I said that's a relative improvement, but still not maybe enough. Larry, the reason I wanted to bring you in here is because you have the unique comparative perspective. You study democracies and failures of democracies around the world. So I want to talk specifically about the period that Ben mentioned earlier, that period between Election Day and the time that the Electoral College votes are counted, which should be January 6th. What are the particular risks that we face? How does the situation in the United States compare to other democracies that have faced risks to their elections, and the kind of the role of both political forces and civil society in terms of keeping or not being able to keep the democracy together?
Well, I'll briefly answer the second of your two questions by saying it's pretty near unique. Brazil had, as you know, in 2022, when Bolsonaro was defeated, a Trump-like figure, an incumbent, a somewhat similar election crisis with him questioning the vote, knocking on the doors of the military, maneuvering to try and hold on to power. There were echoes of similarity. There was even a January 6th-like assault on the Brazilian Congress. But honestly, most of what we're experiencing now, you really just don't see in any of our peer advanced democracies. I spent a lot of time in Taiwan. I observe many of their quadrennial presidential elections. You know, it's a simple system. Everybody votes on the same day. There's a central election commission. The votes are counted at the polling station. They're sent to the Central Election Commission. The result is announced by 8 or 9 o'clock. The loser concedes. The winner is gracious. If only we could be that. But let me just break it up into a few familiar pieces for you, Rick, and probably for our audience. There will be the immediate aftermath of 5 weeks for the presidential election, until states are required on December 11th to certify their results. And then, of course, 6 days later, the electors are supposed to meet in each state to cast their votes. There are 2 possibilities. Well, there's 2.5 possibilities. Possibility 1 is that Trump will win, and like in 2016, people will be in shock, but there won't be widespread allegations of fraud or illegitimacy, and he will move on to become president again. Possibility 1.5, I don't think should be entirely dismissed, and that is that efforts at voter suppression in some states and to intimidate or harass minority voters from voting, and Native Americans on some tribal reservations and so on, in a very close election, that some people, and if Trump wins, some people on the Democratic side could say this would not have happened without efforts to purge the rolls, or there is, I don't know what to make of it. Others may have more knowledge and insight than I do. But there is an effort on the Republican side to organize a lot of observers at the polling stations. There is a very considerable narrative about non-citizens voting and so on. So if that gains momentum, and a lot of people claim they were prevented from voting by one means or another, that could gain some traction. And in any case, the big other possibility is that we have an election pretty much like 2020, with results very similar to 2020, and that we have the red mirage on election night because we're waiting for the absentee ballots to come in. Trump is ahead at, midnight Eastern time. He declares victory. A lot of votes remain to be counted. They come in, a lot of them are absentee ballots that lean blue, and the Democrats narrowly pull out Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Harris is elected president. I mean, Trump has so repeatedly, so certainly, and so adamantly declared that he cannot lose if there's a free and fair election, that I think we have now, sorry to say it so bluntly, a virtual certainty of an election crisis if he loses. And that is going to be, I think, a very, very perilous time, which, as Ben was indicating, is just going to be drenched in disinformation, polarization, suspicion, conspiracy theorizing, and unfortunately a milieu that could be conducive to the kinds of problems Rachel worries about.
Okay, my 7.5 is going up as we have this discussion. So if we've typecast people, we've got the lawyer, the historian, the comparativist, and the expert on political violence. I don't know if we should even be talking about political violence, because talking about political violence maybe makes that more likely. You see polls that suggest that political violence is a major problem. Many of you, this is a spoiler, but it's late enough that I think I can say it. Ben was a consultant on the TV show Succession, and there was a He was the one that I think came up with the scenario of lighting the ballots on fire in Milwaukee and then not knowing what the rules would be to deal with such a situation. That's a kind of action that keeps me up at night, along with a cyber attack on like the city of Detroit. Like, there's lots of bad things that could happen that are extra legal. How worried should we be? And more importantly, what should we be doing as a country so that these things don't come to pass?
So I think I'm going to up your ante a little bit here in your numbers. The good news is that actually very few Americans support political violence. When you look at good polls, there's a lot of horrible polls out there that ask questions like, do you support political violence? And a lot of people think, well, you know, if it was the revolution of 1776, and the answer yes. But good polls, it's usually about 3 or 4% from each party. And the vast majority of Americans are very against it. The bad news is that in a country our size, every 1 percentage point is 2.5 million people. And when you ask them questions that are very specific, you know, do you support assassinating an opponent or what have you, you get pretty high numbers of those 3 or 4 percentages. So it's actually very few people. However, there's enough of them to cause some trouble. The other good news is that we have many, many fewer organized groups now than in 2020. In 2020, we had the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and these real militias. When you look at civil wars, you look at organized groups because it's really hard to have violence on a sustained basis, a kind of civil war basis, if you don't have organized groups. Right now, organized groups are at the lowest point they've been in many, many years. So that's the good news. The bad news is, again, it doesn't take organized groups to have somebody take a pot shot at a presidential candidate, to have a lot of folks coming out to mob election official who they want to intimidate. When you have that red mirage and blue wave that we are expecting, I think, in a number of red states, to have people who are armed to show up, you don't need organized groups for that. So I'm low in belief that we're going to have the kind of civil wars and so on that people are worried about. But I think the likelihood of, during a period of uncertainty of a week or so, which is extremely likely, that we'll have armed people pressuring those who make decisions, very, very likely. And as Franita was saying, I mean, I don't think we have had a sustained level of violence in this country. I don't think that's the useful way of looking at it. We've had punctuated violence in this country really back to the know-nothings in the 1830s. And what happens in our country is every time there's a political realignment, we have violence. Every time the parties are trying to grab vote share from the other party, you end up with political violence because a winner-take-all system like we have is just god-awful for political violence. What it means is that moving one vote in a tight election wins you the whole district. And in a country as polarized as ours in Congress, winning one district might win you power over all of the appointments that the future president will make or what have you. So the stakes are incredibly high to push a small number of voters. When you have a system like that, the incentives are so desirous of violence that it's actually hard to imagine it not getting used in such a powerful country. So these political realignments, when the country starts grabbing from one party to another, which we're in right now with the Republican Party trying to take white working class voters, but also Black and Hispanic men, young men, and so on. As that happens, you're seeing this political violence come out. And I really don't think it's caused solely by one person. I think it has clearly been amped up quite a bit by the rhetoric. We always see that it comes up by political rhetoric, but it's also this structural change, and it won't really go down until either the parties realign or we start changing these underlying structures that are incentivizing the violence.
I want to just follow up with you about the 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump and how they seem to have just, like everything else that's happened, like they roll off the news. I mean, is this because our information environment has changed so much? I mean, you think back to, I can remember, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, and that was a huge deal for a long time. And here it's like, oh, that was last week. And like we just kind of move on from what is, this abhorrent attempt to solve our problems through assassination.
So our news media is in a very weakened state right now. Local news has been decimated, and local news really holds the center of our country. It gives people trust. It gives people an understanding of what's going on. When it's all national news, people can kind of believe whatever they want about the other side, and they do. So you get this very sensationalistic kind of yellow journalism. These two assassination attempts didn't fit into the story that Americans are telling themselves. Americans are telling ourselves that we're extraordinarily polarized. There's truth to that, of course, but it's truth on an emotional level. We're emotionally very polarized, ideologically, actually, not so much. And that emotional truth requires us to say the assassin or the attempted assassination of Trump came from the left. Well, that actually was not true at all. The first one looks much more like a school shooter. And actually, presidential assassinations are always not always like this, but they're much more commonly weirdos. They're much less commonly very strongly ideological people. So someone who's looking for fame and notoriety and is taking it out on the president. But it doesn't fit into the story of polarization. Thank God, because if it had, we could have really had another wave of major violence. Instead, actually, both assassination attempts, what you saw was that Republican support for violence went down in both cases right afterward. Democrats didn't really go down or up, but it has been lower in general. And so in that way, I think it helped people imagine, geez, this could really be bad, and it brought things down. But that also is not the media story, that things are getting better. I mean, right now we're actually at the lowest level of actual violence since 2020. Much higher level of threats, and the threats are believable, and so people are very scared. But the actual violence is very low for politicians and so on. But again, that's not the story. It's a complicated story right now, and we need to be willing to take in the nuance, I think.
Thank you. We are going to come to you for questions a little bit later on in the program. I want to delve now a little bit more into what's happened from the time of 2020 till now that maybe makes an attempt to overturn the results of a fair election harder to do. And so I want to turn specifically to legislation that a few of you mentioned, which is the Electoral Count Reform Act. So let me start with Ben, and then I'll go to all of you. Ben, could you just explain what this thing is? And then what I want to ask all of you is, does this matter? Does law really make a difference in terms of lessening the risk of at least the same thing that we saw in 2020 post-election happening again?
The Electoral Count Reform Act was originally passed in the 1880s and had some very quaint language to it that really got put to a stress test in the events of 2020. And so, as opposed to most legislative attempts in Washington, there was bipartisan agreement on it, largely because it is an act for the future, and neither party could game out how to get advantage under the act. In other words, you react to a recount situation differently if you're ahead or behind. You can't know that in advance. It depends who's sitting in the chair as head of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States. Is that a Democrat or Republican? So both parties saw the messiness of 2020 and realized this antiquated law from the 1800s needed to be updated. So it did a few things. It made it clear that the vice president plays only a ministerial role, not a discretionary role. He or she just has to open the votes, the Electoral College votes, and announce them. It put in some provisions that make it clear that local jurisdictions have deadlines for signing the certificate of ascertainment. There's some provisions in the law that allow for what's called mandamus actions, in other words, forcing the signing officials to get their results into Washington. There are some provisions that arguably deal with catastrophic events that you mentioned before, although I think that you can never quite anticipate what that looks like. So in essence, it was an attempt to clean up what looked to be a dysfunctional law. But nonetheless, It tries to anticipate the future, and that's a really tough thing to do for all the situations that can arise.
So just turning to the other panelists, we heard Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who may again be Speaker of the House, we don't know yet, on January 3rd, 2025, when the new Congress will convene. When he was asked if he would accept the results of whatever the states come up with, he said, if the election is free and fair, which I took as a kind of hedging. And like some people have said, I know Clayton Mitchell, who's one of Trump's lawyer allies, has said, well, the 12th Amendment, might make the ECRA unconstitutional. I don't think that's a strong legal argument, but how much does law constrain? And let me turn to you, Franita. Should we take solace? Should our number go down? Our Richter scale, I think Larry called it earlier before. Maybe that's a bad thing to use in Los Angeles as a metaphor. Should our nervousness go down because of the passage of the ECRA? And how constraining is law?
Law constrains as much as we believe in it, right? Like, there's this movie, I won't name it because it makes me look bad, but there's a character in the movie that says, he supports Napoleon. And his son is like, oh my God, Napoleon was overthrown. What are you doing? And the guy says, treason is a matter of dates, right? I kind of think of law as contextual like that, right? Like law matters when we believe in it. It has less force when we don't. I think we're really living in a time where that's true. So this doesn't mean that we shouldn't do things legally to try to make election outcomes more certain. So the Electoral Count Reform Act is definitely a step in the right direction. But part of our problem is not necessarily legal. We have a people problem, right? We have people who, no matter how many laws we pass, no matter how many safeguards we put into place, they're going to try to figure out ways to subvert the election outcome. And so some ways, if we just stick to law, it reflects a failure of imagination on our part. Because, for example, will there be another January 6th? Maybe, but maybe not, right? But either way, I suspect that there's planning going on to make sure that there's not another January 6th. Why? Because we saw that happen. It's easy to try to prevent what you've already seen, right? But to Ben's point, it's kind of hard to try to anticipate certain dangers because there are just certain things you can't know. So I think that we have to think about law and how we pair it with other things in order for there to be effective change within our system. Because frankly, our norms have changed. Right, we never think about ourselves anymore as a collective. We're very individualistic, which makes it easy for us to hate each other, right? But when we start thinking about each other as a collective, as in we're in this together, then we can start having conversations about shared values and shared ideals again. So no matter how many changes that we make to the law, as long as we think about each other as enemies, none of it really matters in the end, because come election day, we may still find ourselves in a situation where we're at odds.
Larry, so thinking about the Mike Johnson example, I mean, one of the things when I was putting together the advisory board for the Safeguarding Democracy Project, which you're on, I felt like it's very important to have conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, independents sitting together, because it's not just going to be one side of the aisle that's going to be able to keep our democracy going. And so, what are the kind of cross pressures that someone like a Mike Johnson is facing? How do we know how constraining law will be? Who are the levers, who are the actors that really matter when we think about how democracies stay together?
Well, we know what the cross pressures will be. There will be the law and there will be Donald Trump. And if Mike Johnson is still the speaker, he'll have to decide which side he's on if the Democrats have won the presidential election, Trump is claiming it was rigged, and he is demanding that the Republicans try again to overturn the election in the Congress. Now, I mean, you have to play this out in terms of everything that happens because, correct me if I'm wrong, but in order to overturn and reject a state's delegation, Electoral College slate, you need a majority of both the House and Senate. Is that
That's
not
right.
correct?
I'm checking with my attorney here, and he says yes.
Okay.
20% in each house has to object.
For
In
the
order to
objection.
challenge. So the Electoral Count Reform Act did a very good thing by raising the threshold to even file a challenge to 20%, I believe, of each house. Is
Yes.
that correct? But then to succeed in rejecting an electoral, a set of electors from a state, you need a majority of each house. And so we're pondering a situation which is quite plausible, in which Kamala Harris has, in the judgment, I'd say, of independent people and electoral professionals, won the presidency, won a majority of the state of the vote in states with 270 electoral votes, but the Republicans have won the House, which is possible that they will retain, and the Republicans have won the Senate, which is, in my view, highly, highly likely. And then you have to presume that there are not enough Republicans committed to the rule of law and the defense of the Constitution to keep that from happening, to keep them from throwing out electors. And I still, have a bias for hope here. Let's put it that way. I was very influenced by Albert Hirschman and the title of that book. But let me lay something else on the table, which is the other point I wanted to get to, and throw it back to you, the three of you who are lawyers. And this is something that is troubling me a lot without having the legal expertise you have, which is that as a result of their experience in the previous two elections, what I gleaned from the way things have been unfolding is that the Trump loyalists are turning a lot of their attention now to local and county election officials, and to trying to persuade them, if things don't go the right way in critical battleground states, not to certify the election. And so if they can finagle the certification, at least this is the worry that's out there in the literature, and keep an election from being certified at the state level, maybe because there are outstanding claims at the county level, I don't know. We see what's going on in Georgia now with the effort there, which, as I understand, a judge has just overturned a Georgia law that would have made it easier.
It was not a law, but it was a
ruling.
related lawsuit about whether
Okay.
someone had the
All right.
authority.
Well,
to
I
not
think
serve.
you all should shed light on this, because it seems to me, as a political scientist, that if there are debates over certification at the county and state level, it will give the Congress more traction to obstruct things. And I just want to lay one other angle on the table, which is the scenario we keep resurrecting as an element of a kind of nightmarish drama in a certain way, and that is that if you don't have enough Electoral College votes certified and sent to the Congress, and nobody wins 270 electoral votes, then it goes to the House of Representatives. And we can say with a high degree of certainty what will happen then, because whether the Democrats win control of the House or not, we know from reading the Constitution in high school that the Congress then votes, the House of Representatives votes, not by each individual member, but by state delegation, and the Republicans will have a majority there.
I want to come to Rachel before we get to responding to this question. I want, and Larry's actually answer, or Larry's question at the end is actually a good illustration of what I wanted to get to, which is there a kind of a demobilizing danger of spinning out the worst case scenarios? And like, is even having a forum like this counterproductive? Like, how should we be thinking? And we will get to the certification questions for sure, and then I'm going to come to the audience questions. How should we be thinking about how we talk about the risks to our democracy?
So I don't worry that much that we're giving away the game. The scenario in succession, we've scenario planned out. The folks who are intent on violence are opportunistic and likely to do what they're going to do, whether we intelligentsia tell them about it or not. So I'm not worried about that. I worry about normalizing, about making, because people think that what other people think is normal, and they tend to do what their group they think is doing. And so you can change the media, and you kind of move the Overton window by making people think what other people are doing is a normal thing. So I think as long as you're talking about scenarios but denormalizing, you're good. With violence, though, the violence is something that we train people away from at a very, very young age. And by the time you're an adult, very few people are actually very capable of committing violence against another person. It's really people with impulse control problems, aggression, aggressive personalities, and so on. It's why there's so much continuity between domestic violence and other forms of violence, just aggressive people. But the one difference, and so we're not making more aggressive people, I guess, by talking about it, right? There's a certain population out there. However, there's a kind of violence that is righteous in any society. Any society has some violence that we think of as okay. In our society, most societies, protecting children is okay. You're allowed to do violence to protect kids. Most societies also have some historical form of violence that was considered okay. In our case, it's the American Revolution, Mexican Revolution in Mexico or whatever. If you make people think that they are doing violence to protect or to enact something that is considered righteous in their society, then you can get normal people who have been trained away from it. You don't do that by talking in this way about various scenarios, but you do that by the rhetoric that certain political elites are using now, Trump being one of them, who's talking about nefarious groups of people who are here illegally to vote taking citizenship rights, or dehumanizing people, or making people think that their constitutional rights are being taken away and kind of waving the 1776 flag. Those are the ways in which talking about violence normalizes it that we should be really worried about. And what worries me as a non-lawyer, also as someone who studies comparative politics, is just how that rhetoric has become extraordinarily normal, also coated with a religious veneer in many cases, which is another way to add righteousness to violence. And if that kind of language is repeated by elites, people tend to do what they think the leaders of their groups approve of. People really want to belong. We never get past high school, really. And so that desire to belong and the venality of leaders who will use that kind of rhetoric is much more worrisome to me than a conversation like this.
Okay, before I turn to questions, I want to come back to the certification questions. And Ben was ready to jump in, and then I'll turn to Franita if she has anything to add.
I want to be able to lower Larry's Richter scale number here. Certifications in every state, there's been a lot of rhetoric about this lately, but certifications in every state are mandatory for the local election officials to do. There is not a state law in the country that gives a board or a certifying authority the chance to muck things up and mess around with the deadlines. It's been tried in a few counties. It has failed every time they've tried it. A few officials who tried to delay certification are now under criminal indictment. That should be a true lesson to them. The reason is pretty simple. The certification is necessary to bring a recount or a contest or litigation, which is the proper forum for discussing irregularities that may have occurred in election, not from a group of unelected people. To do that, a Georgia judge just put the Georgia Election Board back in its box. Now, the other thing is, if you deny certification on the presidential race, that denies certification on every race on the ballot. You can't just have it for the presidential race. And so if it is Republican county boards who are denying certification on the presidential basis to help Donald Trump, they are denying the certifications to all Republican elected officials, including members of Congress, who presumably are part of the worry about a contingent election in the House. And one other factor of the Electoral Count Reform Act is that if a state fails to provide a certificate of ascertainment for its electors, then the denominator of the number of votes you need in the Electoral College is reduced. So it's no longer 270.
Can I just say
One
more thing? You mentioned a very important word there, which is judge. And there's a guy named Ben Ginsberg who I meet in the hallways at Hoover and follow on the news, who I think made the point not too long ago, I don't remember in which venue, that one of the things that saved us in 2020 is that in something like 63 of 64 judicial decisions involving Trump's appeals, he lost in the courts. And so if that holds again, maybe we can lower the Richter scale rating a bit?
Maybe so. Franita, did you want to weigh in on any of these?
I don't want to have the last word. That was good.
Okay. I was going to say on judges, I've been speaking to judges around the country, Democratic elected or appointed and Republican elected or appointed, and they really do want to do their part for democracy. They, one of the strongest opinions that was written in that period was by Stefanos Bibas, who is a longstanding conservative former professor, Federalist Society member, and he wrote an opinion in Trump versus Pennsylvania, and where he talked about, basically said free and fair elections are the lifeblood of American democracy, and saying an election is unfair doesn't make it so. You actually have to come with proof, and there was no proof. I'm paraphrasing. He said it much more eloquently than I did. And I was on a panel with Bibas at the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference, and he talked about the threats of physical violence that he and his family faced after writing that. So although the judges want to do the right thing, as do election administrators, some of them are afraid. I mean, at every judicial conference I've spoken at since 2020, I look at the schedule of what else is being discussed. There is something there about judicial security. So that's an issue too. I did want to get to one more thing, I'm sorry, before we turn to the audience, which I said I would come back to, which is Pennsylvania and the blue shift, the red mirage and all of that, and just kind of explain all of that, because we kind of talked in a shorthand. So the idea is that in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they've not changed their rules for how absentee or mail-in ballots are handled, in that most other states, when the ballots come in, they're pre-processed, they're pre-canvassed. They basically look at everything, make sure the ballot is ready to be counted or has to be set aside because it's missing a signature or something like that. So then by an election day comes, you just can run the ballots through the machine. Pennsylvania doesn't do that, and because they had this great influx of ballots, there is a great delay because they won't start till 7 a.m. on election day, which is why Tuesday night after election in 2020, Trump was ahead by 160,000. By the time we get to Saturday, Biden wins the state by about 80,000 votes. Let's talk a little bit, and the reason we saw the shift is because Democrats were much more interested in voting by mail during the pandemic than Republicans, in part because Trump was discouraging voting by mail. So, Ben, I take it that you think we're going to see this again, this shift. I don't know if you know the number of mail ballots. And is there anything to do about it if under scenario 2 from Larry, Trump's declaring victory no matter what? And we have this, I don't know what you called it, soupy, dicey, yeasty period. Like
Yeasty.
Okay, what can we do about this?
The best thing to do about it is to recognize the reality that you're not going to get you're not going to know who won on election night. I mean, in every one of those states, you'll have 70% of the ballots in and counted and tabulated on election night. And in most elections, when the margin between the candidates is large, you can call an election based on 70% of the vote. But if it's a narrow margin, then you have to wait for all the votes to come in. And there are slow counting processes. Election officials are fond of saying that results are never official on election night. That doesn't come for 3 weeks later in the certification. There's public pressure to know. There's certainly news media pressure to know the results on election night. So that's what happens. But Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona gets 500,000 walk-in votes in Maricopa County on election day that they have to process, and it's very slow. Georgia is traditionally good at getting its votes in. North Carolina has got the storm damage parts, which will probably increase its number of mail ballots. So that'll take longer. Michigan passed some laws that will actually move up its count further. So the battleground states, North Carolina will be first.
And of course, if control of Congress is at stake and we're waiting for California, good luck.
And New York, which
It just takes
terrible.
forever.
Yeah. Right, because there is a law that allows absentee ballots to come in 7 days in California, 7 days in New York after the election in the name of enfranchising more voters, but that has a real downside in terms of getting the results quickly.
Anyone? Franita?
So I think this will be true for the foreseeable future, right? We shouldn't see it as a 2020, 2024 problem. In part, as long as we are polarized, then our elections will be close. And one thing we should try to do is normalize patience in these situations. I think that this is a downside of the way that our media operates now, right? If the media is coming from a very disadvantaged position, it is newsworthy to be able to be the first station to announce who has won which state. And who has won the election writ large. And so the incentive structure is all messed up here, but it actually has a pretty significant downside for our democracy.
All right, let's turn it to some audience questions, and there'll be people coming around with mics. I don't get to call on anyone, so we will just wait for a question. We can't see any of you with the lights, so we'll just wait to hear a question come from the lights.
Hi, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's a three-part question, but it's not as complicated as it sounds. How much of everything we've talked about all night is related to the Electoral College and not having the direct election of the president? And you all have you've been around different lengths of time, but over the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and you've all been very active for some time, have your views on the Electoral College changed? I don't know what they are, but I understand the theory of the Electoral College. But would a direct election of the president actually help any of what we're talking about? And if so, is there any chance in the foreseeable future that there's any semblance of the Congress of the country considering that big a change?
Before any of the panelists answer, we did have a panel last week on the very topic, and I would point you to the Hammer Museum website and to the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, which is safeguardingdemocracyproject.org, and you can hear a very great discussion on that. But let me see if any of our panelists want to weigh in on, does the Electoral College make these problems with our free and fair elections worse, better? I'm not talking about the representation issue, but the chances of not having
I'll just jump in and say that our popular vote is not nearly as tight as our electoral vote. And so it all comes back to what Franita's saying. We're extraordinarily polarized. And so anything that makes that polarization more of a knife edge, like a winner-take-all system, like the Electoral College right now, but that is not the case always. Sometimes the Electoral College makes it less likely. But right now, the popular vote is more clear, and so the Electoral College makes it tighter, and therefore we're very worried about all these knife-edge problems. However, I think there's virtually no chance that it will change. The only possible hope is these various states that have gotten together and said that, you know, if enough states get together, we'll allocate our votes differently. But even that isn't very close. So it's not really a necessarily useful way of looking at it. I would also say that the hatred in people's hearts is hard to change based on structures. So I think if you change the Electoral College system and you have a popular vote, well, right now we're in a period in which one party is likely to be winning the presidency in a popular vote. So that the fight would go into some other venue because you're not going to have one party willing to be a permanent minority at the presidential level. So it would shift it. I don't know quite how. I would leave it to my esteemed legal colleagues. But I don't think it would necessarily solve it.
Franita.
So I think that there's a disconnect between our democratic expectations and our institutional structures, right? We have an 18th century structure that was adopted at a time where democracy was not the goal. Yet we expect it to operate in democratic ways. We actually have to have a come to Jesus moment with ourselves that the Electoral College actually operates the way it was intended. And so when the person who wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote goes on to become president, that's how it works, right? And so to the extent that we continue having elections that are inconsistent with our expectations for ourselves as a democracy, it's our own fault. And because of that, I find myself increasingly agnostic about the existence of the Electoral College because I'm tired of us not fixing the problems that we complain about.
Next question, please. They're coming with a mic.
This is another problem that hasn't been discussed. An hour ago or so, an Afghan man in the United States legally was arrested. He was planning a mass shooting at a voting site here in the United States. You'll hear about that tomorrow. He apparently was arrested with French intelligence involved. He's ISIS-K, and so that raises another issue, whether or not people are going to be frightened away from going to the polls because worried about a mass shooting.
That sounds like a Rachel question.
I suppose it is. I don't know about that case. I haven't been reading the news in the last hour. I will say that in general, violence on election day is extraordinarily rare. In 2022, there was a lot of people that got all worried about armed people at drop boxes. And in fact, there was one armed person at one drop box in the entire country, more than 13,000 drop boxes, and it got thrown all over the news everywhere. You're going to have sporadic things. We have a lot of guns in this country. We have a good number of people who are right on the edge. There will be sporadic issues, I'm sure. But voting day is usually a pretty safe day, even in the worst of democracies, because both sides are really trying to get their people out to vote. And it's not the thing that I would be most worried about. I am worried about a mass shooting before, especially for immigrant communities because of the level of anger and discussion about immigrants right now going on. But I think on voting day, things do happen in a country as armed as ours, but I'm not thinking of it as something that is most likely. It's the aftermath that's really the concerning part, using the violence, as you were saying about the judges, using the violence to pressure people to come out a certain way because they're scared.
Let me just follow up and ask, maybe Ben's the right person for this, about all of the focus on non-citizen voting now. What do you make of it? And do you think it is laying the groundwork for some kind of viable strategy, or is this just a messaging thing?
I believe it's a messaging thing. Having talked to election officials, they are convinced that non-citizen voting is extraordinarily rare in this country, that there are checks and balances in the voter rolls that stop non-citizens from voting. And you have to put yourself in the position of a non-citizen who would go into a polling place to vote. At that point, for casting one ballot in a race, you are putting your very future at risk, because if you're caught as a non-citizen trying to vote, you're deported right away. And so the cost-benefit analysis for someone deliberately going in and trying to vote as a non-citizen is just non-existent, I think.
Just to correct you, I think that you can get imprisoned first before you're deported.
You can probably get imprisoned. It may not be immediate deportation.
We'll take one or two more questions from the audience before we wrap up.
Yes, hi. I was wondering to get your opinion. We recently had a fairly strong hurricane hit Florida and Georgia and North Carolina. Roads washed out. Power is still not returned to some areas. There looks like there's another system in the Gulf. What do you think, how would it play out should there not be power at polling stations in Florida or North Carolina or Georgia close to the election, how would people vote? How would it play out in terms of, if it's so close, what kind of impact would that have?
That's a really great question. I've been thinking the same thing for about 2 weeks now, so thank you for asking.
Well, there are two examples to look to. One is Hurricane Sandy that hit right before the 2004 election. 12, sorry. And the other is September 11th in New York, which fell right around the mayoral election. And what they did was allow voting a few days later. It is one of the weaknesses in the Electoral Count Reform Act, and what would happen on the presidential level with much stricter timelines. I think it's one of those issues that we really haven't come to grips with, but there is general language in the law that says there would be a circumscribed area that is affected, and the voters in that area would be allowed to vote at a later date.
Can I just ask, because I really have been thinking about this, who is the they who would allow it? Is it the courts?
That's part of it not being really thought out. So in each state, I believe that there are elected officials who are sort of assigned to deal with the question. But I think given that whatever answer the elected officials come up with, one party or the other might not like that answer and therefore would go to court, so it would ultimately be up to the courts.
Okay, we'll take one final question.
This question is for Professor Hasen. You have faith in the judicial system to protect us as it did in 2020. Would you still have that type of faith if one of these challenges went all the way up to the Supreme Court, in light of the fact they grabbed the question of immunity and took it and ruled in a way that nobody expected?
So I think that when you think about the courts, I kind of divide what the courts do in terms of kind of normal politics, where increasingly the justices divide along ideological and party lines, with the question of the politics of peaceful transitions of power. And if you look at the two pieces of evidence that are the strongest is the Supreme Court rejecting a case that Texas brought directly to the Supreme Court trying to get votes overturned. It was a perfect vehicle because it was a case didn't go through the lower courts, right at the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court was going to be lawless, that was the moment to do it, and not a single justice was willing to address it on the merits. And then the other was, there was a case that the court decided in 2023 called Moore versus Harper. It's probably the most complicated case in election law, period, like to just try to explain it briefly, so I won't. But I'll just say that the court in that case rejected an extreme version that legislatures have a kind of free-floating power to do whatever they want and overturn the will of the voters. Even that got maybe 2 votes on the court. So I think that even though the judges and justices are divided along ideological lines on, for example, how to read the Voting Rights Act or what to think about campaign finance reform, so far they've held the line on free and fair elections. And part of my work I see is telling them, great, keep doing that. And that's really the message we're trying to give the courts. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on the role of the judiciary here. No? If not, let me thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.